What if France won the 7 Years' War? Picture blue banners curling over the St. Lawrence, fleur-de-lis stitched in silk, as British guns fall silent in the cold. Picture Bengal's riverboats stacked with cotton and indigo sailing under French colors. The world's first truly global war ends, and history tilts, not toward London, toward Paris. Let's anchor ourselves in what really happened. From 1756 to 1763, Britain and France waged a world war across continents. Forests of North America, ports of West Africa, fortresses of India, and the fog-choked Channel. Britain, powered by its navy and William Pitt's strategy, cracked France's empire. In 1757, Robert Clive seized Bengal at Plassey. In 1759, after brutal fighting on the Plains of Abraham, Quebec fell. By the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France ceded most of North America, lost its Indian ambitions, and Britain rose as the global hegemon. That victory came with a price: debt, taxes, tension, the American Revolution. Meanwhile, France's debts and humiliation fermented a different explosion: the French Revolution, and then Napoleon. Now twist the kaleidoscope. We change 3 moments. First, Quebec. Montcalm digs deeper redoubts on the heights, refuses a rash attack, and starves the British assault through one more winter. The Royal Navy can't keep supply lines open when ice locks the river. The British withdraw, bloodied, before spring can save them. Second, Bengal. Mir Jafar hesitates. The Bengal monsoon turns roads to soup, and Clive's midnight plans unravel. French officers advising Siraj-ud-Dowlah coordinate artillery with local forces, and Plassey flips. The British East India Company is driven into the sea at Chandernagore. Third, the sea itself. The French fleet avoids the worst of Quiberon Bay, no catastrophic annihilation. So French convoys keep trickling men and money across the oceans, just enough to hold. The war drags but sours for Britain. Sugar Islands matter, yes, but they're not worth the bleeding. Pitt faces a parliament tiring of taxes and torn by faction. Spain leans harder into the Bourbon family compact. Britain looks at a board it can no longer dominate and chooses a compromise. Treaty time. Only this treaty looks nothing like the one you know. In 1763, Paris isn't prostrate. It is poised. France retains New France intact. Quebec, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, and the full spine of the Mississippi down to New Orleans. The Mississippi becomes a French river, a blue ribbon tying prairie to port. Britain, bruised, bargains for a handful of Caribbean sugar islands and keeps its core Atlantic colonies, Virginia to Massachusetts, but they're hemmed in. In India, the French East India Company secures a sweeping charter across Bengal's wealth and influence from Pondicherry to the Deccan. Company rule becomes a Franco-Indian mosaic rather than a British Raj. On paper, Britain survives. In reality, a center of gravity shifts. From this point forward, the wind fills French sails. North America changes first. The 13 British colonies are boxed against the Appalachian Wall. To the west, a French Algonquin world stretches vast and organized, a patchwork of forts, mission towns, and native confederacies embedded into the French trade system. Instead of a settler tide rolling west, you get a frontier of diplomacy, presence, and careful passes through native territories. French policy isn't altruistic, it's pragmatic. Trade over towns, alliances over mass displacement. The result? A powerful indigenous buffer from the Great Lakes to the plains. Nations like the Haudenosaunee, the Odawa, and the Anishinaabe find leverage in a French order that prefers partners to mass colonists. And in the British colonies, without a triumphant Britain demanding taxes to service a mountain of debt after a colossal victory, the Stamp Act crisis looks different. London still wants revenue, but it's not chasing a war debt of the same scale. Because it didn't win big, it escaped worse. Instead, British fears harden around security. They keep more redcoats along the frontier, not to police newly gained lands, but to guard against French influence breathing across the mountains. The proclamation line of 1763? It still comes, but not as a temporary break. It feels like a permanent wall. Land-hungry colonists stew, not because of taxes alone, But because the West is locked behind a French key, so does the American Revolution still happen? Yes and no. The grievances spark. The familiar words about representation, the rights of Englishmen, but the context is colder. Colonists know that beyond the ridge lies a rival empire that will not bankroll their rebellion. In our timeline, France paid the American bill in blood and treasure, out of revenge for 1763. Here, France has no revenge to seek. It has everything to lose from a British breakaway that might spill settlers into its native alliance zones. So when Boston smolders, French shipments of muskets don't quietly sail. French diplomats do. They offer trade to New York merchants, river access to western furs, and a warning. An independent Atlantic Republic could draw war to everyone's doorstep. Without French funds, the Continental Army looks less continental and more scattered. A short revolt flares in the late 1770s and gets crushed, hard. Call it the Boston Rising. Washington's courage is real, but without powder, coin, and French fleets, Yorktown never arrives. London grants a few charters, tweaks taxes, and tightens the frontier. The colonists wait for a better century. Downriver in New Orleans, a different America hums. It's French, Caribbean, Native, and African, braided together by trade. The Mississippi Valley becomes the heart of a Pax Gallica, a corridor policed by French forts, run by Creole merchants, and tied to Paris by ships cutting past Cuba and along the Atlantic. New France doesn't explode with settlers, it matures. The fur trade remains elite, but wheat from the prairies and timber from the north start feeding a hungry Europe. When steamboats arrive in the early 1800s, they arrive on French rivers first, the St. Lawrence and Mississippi, turning two arteries into engines. Across the ocean, Bengal changes the fate of Paris. In our world, France's fiscal crisis spiraled because wars kept draining an inefficient system. Here, Bengal's revenues, shared and negotiated with Nawabs and Zamindars, flow into a reformed French treasury. It's not a fire hose. India isn't a slot machine, but even a stable, reliable stream from Calcutta's docks brings resilience. Technocrats in Versailles push through earlier fiscal reforms, co-opting the language of the philosophes to modernize without burning the estate down. The Estates General still convenes in the 1780s. Public opinion is a force now, but the outcome is a charter monarchy, not the terror. Imagine a charter of 1789, rights of man softened into rights of the realm, a constitutional framework that trims privilege, establishes a national assembly, and leaves the king on a shorter leash. No Jacobins, no Robespierre, no Napoleon. That one change, no man on a white horse riding out of revolution, reverberates everywhere. Without Napoleon, Europe doesn't get bulldozed and rebuilt in a decade. The Holy Roman Empire limps on, patchy and archaic, but less shattered. Prussia reforms, Austria jockeys, and a German nation still coalesces in the 19th century, but later, slower, with more Austria and less Prussian steel. No lightning rod humiliation at Jena, no Code Napoleon bulldozed across borders. Civil codes spread more gradually through legal commissions. France still leads, but as a teacher, not a conqueror. The map of Italy? It consolidates slower with a looser federation under Savoy, because there's no Napoleonic scaffolding to copy. Britain, for its part, doesn't vanish. It industrializes anyway. Coal is still black and hungry in the north. Spinning jennies still whir. Steam still thunders. But Britain must play in a world where French squadrons contest more seas and French tariffs can bite. London turns inward and eastward, deepening hold over the Atlantic seaboard colonies, investing in shipyards, court reform, and eventually forging a different imperial ideology. More commercial federation, less territorial swallow. In time, Britain grants its Atlantic colonies dominion status as a bloc, the Dominion of Columbia, stretching from Nova Scotia down past the Chesapeake. Self-governing, loyal, English-speaking, and coastal. The prairies, French. What about slavery? This timeline carries a jarring moral swerve. In our world, the independent United States extended slavery west, fought a civil war, and abolished it in 1865. Britain abolished slavery in its empire in 1833. Here, there is no independent U.S. in 1833. The British Atlantic colonies are still British, and thus slavery on southern plantations ends 3 decades earlier under imperial law. The Chesapeake and Carolinas convulse, but with garrisons and compensation schemes, emancipation arrives without a Civil War's cannon. To the west, under French rule, Louisiana's plantation system evolves under a different legal regime. France, under its charter monarchy, abolishes the slave trade earlier under pressure from philosophes and British diplomacy, then slavery itself in stages by the 1840s. The human cost is still grievous, but the end comes piecemeal and sooner. The legacies, Creole cultures, black republics in the Caribbean, mixed language cities on the Mississippi, are richer and more rooted. India under French influence becomes a tapestry of negotiated modernity. The French East India Company, heavily watched by Paris after the 1760s, is forced into a hybrid model by the 1790s, semi-state, semi-merchant, with Indian financiers on the board. Railroads thread the Ganges Plain by mid-century, often built by French engineers in partnership with Bengali bankers. Calcutta becomes a bilingual capital, Bengali and French on street signs, Persian in old courts lingering like perfume. There is exploitation. Empire is empire. But the administrative style borrows from French civil service, exams, centralized prefects, codified law. The Indian middle class grows in French lycées and Calcutta salons, then uses that education to demand more. By the 1880s, Paris faces the same question as London. How do you govern a continent by telegraph? The answer becomes a commonwealth model, decades earlier than you might expect. Science and technology skitter in new directions. Without a French Revolution, there is no sudden, centrally mandated metric system. Instead, a decimal reform emerges from academies in the 1790s and spreads by trade decree, slower, messier. You get a century of dual measures, pounds beside livres, inches beside centimeters, before global standards settle at Paris-led conferences around 1870. Steam power still explodes, but its heartland is split. Manchester textiles duel with Lion silk mills. Stephenson's rockets whistle in Yorkshire while French steamers churn the St. Lawrence. Telegraph lines snap across the Atlantic earlier via French-backed cable routes landing in Newfoundland and down to Brest. When internal combustion roars, it roars in Paris workshops and Rhineland factories. Detroit, a coastal Dominion port, busy and British, but not the Motor City. The cultural map feels different under your feet. The language of diplomacy remains French well into the 20th century, not out of aristocratic habit alone, but because half of North America and a great slice of India speak it daily. Newspapers in Quebec and New Orleans spar with London papers. The feuilleton culture of Paris goes transatlantic. And jazz, because yes, black music strips beyond borders, emerges not just in New Orleans but in Montreal's smoky clubs, then spills into Paris decades earlier, shaping global sound. And the wars you're waiting for? They still come. History is not a place without thunder, but they sound different. Without a Napoleonic earthquake, German unification comes later and less violently, leaving a Germany more federal and less brittle. There is still rivalry with France. There are still crises in Alsace-Lorraine. Though in this world, those provinces never trade hands, because there's no 1870 defeat to seize them. Instead, Europe sees a series of contained wars, mid-century scuffles that redraw a line here, a tariff there, but no single ignition that lights a 1914 fuse. The Balkans smolder as always, but great powers, France with a stake in India, Britain managing an Atlantic dominion, Austria clinging to reform, prefer conferences to catastrophes. Nuclear physics still blooms, Curie still glows in the lab light. But when the bomb is born, it's likely born not in a desert across an independent American West, but under the auspices of a Franco-British Indian consortium, tested in the Sahara or the Australian outback, contained by a multinational security regime born from a century of imperial negotiation. Imagine a post-war world, after a different kind of war, perhaps an Asian crisis in the 1940s, that coalesces into a league with real teeth because empires learned to federate earlier. The United Nations may wear a different face, meeting alternately in Paris, Calcutta, and Quebec. At street level, your map app is bilingual. The St. Lawrence Seaway is the busiest corridor in the hemisphere. The Mississippi's towboats push barges marked in French. The border between the Dominion of Columbia and New France is calm, policed by customs officers who speak both languages and share coffee across the line. Baseball grows along the coast, a different game, call it lacrosse, still rooted in Indigenous tradition, becomes the great continental sport, embraced by French and British towns alike. History doesn't end, it meanders. And yet there are costs. The settler pressure that never crashed west as hard, saved lands and lives, yes. But it also froze energies that in our world exploded into Republican experiments and a distinct American culture. In this world, liberty comes through paperwork and charters, not declarations and musket shots. It's steadier, but slower. Some revolutions arrive as reforms, and some injustices linger behind elegant laws. Here's the fulcrum. A single treaty in 1763 shifts debt, dignity, and destiny. No British windfall, no American independence in the 1770s, no French collapse into terror, no Corsican artillery officer crowned in Notre Dame. A century later, the world speaks more French, bargains more, and centralizes less. The map you recognize, the British pink splashed across a quarter of the globe, becomes a balanced palette instead. French blue running bold from Quebec to Calcutta. Midway through this alternate story, pause with me. If France had emerged supreme in 1763, what language do you think would have become the true global default by 1900? French, English, or something hybrid from the Atlantic world? Tell me in the comments. And if you're enjoying this journey through a world that could have been, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next leap. Let's drill deeper into 3 pillars: people, money, and law, to feel this world under your fingertips. People first. Indigenous nations aren't fixed in amber. They adapt and rule. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy leverages French alliances to secure an enormous semi-autonomous zone around the Great Lakes, codified in a tri-party compact with Paris and Quebec. French administrators, accustomed to negotiating with Indian polities in India, bring that habit to North America, building councils that include native chiefs, Creole merchants, and colonial officers. Languages blend. Wampum belts are read beside parchment decrees. The result is not utopia. It is a politics of respect born of necessity. Displacement still happens. Disease does not obey treaties. But the pace and scale change, and entire nations endure into the industrial age with recognized borders and schools that teach both their language and French. Money. With Bengal's trade humming and Quebec's wheat feeding Europe, the French monarchy leans into early central banking. The Caisse d'Escompte becomes the Banque de France 2 decades sooner, stabilizing currency and financing infrastructure. Paris funds canals up the Richelieu and locks along the Mississippi, gliding barges past rapids that once strangled trade. British financiers answer by turning London into a service empire. Insurance, shipping, and law knit the Atlantic colonies to the city. You can feel the twin poles forming, Paris exporting goods and codes, London exporting contracts and credit. Law. Without the Napoleonic Code's blitz, legal modernization is slower, but broader. French jurists compile a civil digest in the 1810s that becomes a template by persuasion, not conquest. Quebec adopts it, Louisiana codifies it, Bengal adapts it around personal law. British common law retains its dominion along the coast. The Atlantic becomes a legal laboratory where a ship docking in New Orleans passes from one family of law to another in a week. That friction sparks innovation. Mixed courts for maritime claims, bilingual judges, the first real experiments in international arbitration by the 1860s. By the dawn of the 20th century, the map looks unlike your schoolroom atlas. A blue arc, New France, runs from Labrador down the Great Lakes, through the prairie breadbasket, to a glittering New Orleans, the Paris of the river, all steamboats and gaslight and Creole cafes. East of the Appalachians, the Dominion of Columbia waves a red ensign, British and self-governed, from Boston to Charleston. Across the Atlantic, France anchors a commonwealth that includes Quebec and a federated Bengal. London presides over a commercial empire tied by British law and the Royal Navy. Germany is big, federal, and busy, not yet the engine of a catastrophic war. Russia broods and reforms in cycles. The Ottomans survive longer on European loans. The world is multipolar, more negotiated, less explosive, until it isn't. Because the fault lines don't disappear, they creep. Asia becomes the pressure zone. A rising Japan still explodes into modernity. A French-allied Bengal and a British-friendly coastal China create rival investment spheres. A war in the Pacific in the 1940s likely ignites, but the coalition fighting it looks different. French, British, Indian, and colonial troops fighting side by side from Saigon to Shanghai. The post-war settlement faces the same question our world faced. Can empires become partners, or must they become memories? Having practiced federation for a century, they choose partnership more easily than our world did. Decolonization is still messy, but it comes with more treaties and fewer partitions. One hopes fewer catastrophes. And the everyday? The mundane miracles? The first transcontinental train across North America, French gauge, wide and smooth, cuts from Quebec City to New Orleans in the 1880s. The Great World's Fair of 1900 is hosted simultaneously in Paris and Montreal, linked by live telegraph commentary and early motion pictures. Cinema's beating heart sits in Paris and Quebec, not just Los Angeles. When a young inventor dreams of radio, he listens to a station in Toulouse and another on Cape Breton. When a young nurse learns vaccines, she reads in French, English, and Bengali. All of it traces back to those hinge years when a general held his nerve at Quebec, a monsoon swallowed an army in Bengal, and a navy refused to die in a storm. One treaty later, debt ran another way, pride sat in another capital, and a different century unfolded. History is not inevitable. It is 1,000 choices, some made in mud, some inked on vellum. Could Britain have clawed back in the 1800s? Absolutely. Could a revolution have erupted in France anyway? Of course, these worlds are probabilistic, not preordained. But this one, this blue-threaded world of New France and a federated India, feels coherent. It matches incentives. It respects geography. It asks you to imagine a North America where your morning coffee could be ordered in French without sounding chic, where maps feel familiar and foreign at once, and where the centers of the world beat in Paris, Quebec, Calcutta, and London, not just Washington and New York. What if France won the 7 Years' War? Then the world you take for granted would still be electric and modern, but tuned to a different key. Not better, not worse, just undeniably changed.